why don't we start with a round of introductions? Yeah, I'm Marie Judah. Yeah, I'm the chair of Neurodiverse Self-Advocacy. Kristen?
Yeah, so we have our little introduction slide here. So I am Kristen Bodema-Butel. I'm an associate professor of special education in the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College. So I'm in Boston now. My research interests are in autistic social interaction and how that influences development.
I'm Brittany Han. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences at The Ohio State University. And my research focuses on healthcare utilization and health outcomes of adults and ways to make healthcare more accessible.
I'm Stephen Kapp, and I am a lecturer in psychology at the University of Portsmouth. I'm jokingly the token autistic of the group, but I've been part of the neurodiversity movement, and I've researched it and done participatory research and tried to do kind of practical research about quality of life areas and identity and what have you.
Right.
I'm Jessica Lester. I'm an associate professor of inquiry methodology, research methodology in the School of Education at Indiana University. And my work primarily focuses on studying and developing methodologies for use to study language and make sense of how we make sense of the world through our use of language.
And I'm Noah Sasson. I'm an associate professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I try to understand what contributes to social difficulties for autistic people, both autistic differences, but also environmental circumstances that can make those difficulties more challenging.
I'm sorry for these sounds, but I'm not sure how to mute them. Yeah, so why don't we kick off?
Okay. I'm just going to go back one slide. So the title of our talk, well, first, I just want to say thank you. We're all really pleased to be here, especially during these fraught times we're living in, where I feel like having a forum to talk about the kinds of things we're interested in is few and far between. So our talk is titled Ableist Language, What It Is, What It Does, and How We Can Change It. This talk was inspired by a paper that the five of us recently published. So we kind of summarized some of the things that we took away as we were writing that paper. And I want to say up front that a lot of what we present here and a lot of what informed our ideas are autistic people and the things they have written. To give a brief overview of our talk, we're all going to kind of participate in this talk. I'll start by giving a definition of ableism and a definition of the deficit model, and then I will pass it to Jessica, and she is going to talk about the impacts of language and how the way we talk about disability influences how we think about disability. And then Stephen will talk about the neurodiversity movement and how that movement has been on the forefront of countering deficit narratives of autism. And then Brittany will take over, and she's going to give some specific examples of ableist terms that appear all the time in autism research literature. And she's going to discuss some alternatives that have been proposed by autistic people. And then Noah is going to talk about some researcher reflections. So how does ableist language influence what researchers do and how the kinds of things that we study and how we interpret the things that we study. And then I will just offer one closing slide with some future directions that we hope will come out of reconsiderations of the way that we use language to communicate about autism. Okay, so, I also want to say that we designed this talk so that we have a few questions for the audience at a few different points. So I think it should be possible for participants to pose answer to these questions in the chat, or I think there's a little hand you can raise in the participant menu. I will say that I actually can't see that because I'm sharing my screen. So maybe Marie, you can kind of monitor the chat box. Would that work? Awesome. Okay, so I'll just give you the definition of ableism that we use for our project. So according to the Center for Disability Rights, Ableism is comprised of beliefs and practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities. And this often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be fixed in one form or the other. So a lot of the services and supports that are currently available for autistic people in some cases are made under the assumption that autistic people need to be less autistic and that that would be the best outcome for them. So we argue that that is an ableist framework, and we think that part of that ableism is perpetuated through how we talk about autism. So ableism can have all kinds of negative impacts for disabled people, and there's empirical evidence to show that for autistic people in particular, this can result in underemployment or unemployment, mental health disabilities, and victimization. So the first question we have for the audience participants is, if you're willing to share this, if you can give us some examples of how ableism may have impacted your own life.
Or if you want to put some comments in the chat. So how does I don't have any comments. So I'm thinking, does anyone have any comments of how ableism affects your life?
There are several people commenting in the chat.
It has held my career back due to ableist focus on how things are done by people assuming quietness is not cleverness. Yeah, these are the 2 points so far. I also think that it's all about the assumption that it's a tragedy and it's a negative, and therefore, people immediately start commenting, oh, you don't look autistic, because they're not comfortable with accepting that autistic is okay. So they try to minimize it by saying, well, you are okay, just this little autistic bit, that's a bit of a bother, but I'm okay with that. Yeah, so that's why there is this controversy of the language that, accepting autistic, full-blown autistic is counterintuitive for people due to bias.
Yeah, so those are all perfect examples. And part of the case that we're trying to make is that those issues are not inherent features of autism. It's because autism is interpreted under an ableist lens, as Marie has articulated. Okay, so let's see.
There are more comments coming in that are wonderful. I bet we're not going to have time to share them all, but hopefully we can save this chat log, and we're going to have more opportunities to participate coming up.
Okay, so now I'm going to describe the deficit model and how it informs how we think and talk about autism. So deficit models describe groups of people almost exclusively by talking about traits that are thought to be deficient or things that are thought to be lacking. And the comparison is always non-autistic people in the case of how the deficit model works to define autism. So in this framework, any positive features of autism or even neutral features are completely ignored. So autism comes to be framed exclusively as something that a group of people are unable to do. Another thing that's ignored in this model is the role of society in creating disability. So the social model is a model of disability that arose in to reject the medical model or the deficit model. And according to the social model, impairments plus social barriers that are constructed by society, that is what results in disability. So disability is not inherent to the person. It depends on the social context that they're in. So in the case of autism, if you have social communication impairments and you are in a social context where expectations about interaction are based on non-autistic people, this could result in a disability related to social interaction. So autistic disabilities are not inherent to being autistic, but it has to do with how you are situated in society and whether you're accommodated or not. So this impacts how we think and talk about autism. So the deficit model is reflected in how we speak and write. And it further cements ways of thinking about autism exclusively as a collection of deficits. So it's kind of a cycle. The deficit model promotes this way of talking about autism, and this way of talking about autism promotes us to think about autism as a collection of deficits. So examples of deficit model language could be the three examples that I have here, which are very common in research circles and maybe things that participants have heard as well. Things like autistic people don't have a theory of mind, or autistic people are unable to have friends, or autistic people are unable to be employed. So none of these examples here account for the fact that these deficits or differences are the way they are because of the social context that autistic people find themselves in. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, and she is going to give a little bit more of a detailed overview of how language works.
And she's going to need to be unmuted if you can do that for her.
Brittany.
No, Jessica.
Jessica.
Yeah.
She needs to unmute herself.
Okay,
I've
she's
done that.
unmuted
Thank you.
now.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Thank you, Marie. So underlying the paper and kind of our collective argument here is this idea that language does something. And so a critical question that is an assumption that we bring to this work is really asking ourselves, what's accomplished when we talk, when we speak? So what's being done through language? And if we think about everyday examples, we know that we are essentially going about our lives, going about our business, doing life through our use of language. So we argue with our language, we offer people advice, we do things like school, we do things like work, we display that we know something, we even display that we don't know something. We also do things like construct or craft people's identities. People might ascribe an identity to us, and we resist that through language. Another example is we do politeness. So as an example of politeness, there's a lot of research that has highlighted how in Western cultures, politeness around saying no often assumes that when you say no to a request, that you have to give a long explanation as to why you're not going to do something. In contrast to when you say yes, you can just say, sure, I'll come. So those are just some examples of how fundamentally it is through language that we are accomplishing life, that realities, identities are being built. Can you go to the next slide? In the paper, we talk a little bit about this idea of how language is shaping the world. And we use this as really the foundation to think about what this means for autistic people and the ways in which autism is even written about. So a fundamental assumption for us is this idea that language reflects and really builds the ways we think about people, the way we think about life, the way we think about the world around us. And then over time, the way we talk about life and others really becomes taken for granted and becomes naturalized for good and for bad, and becomes something that we over time may not even question. So speaking and writing then are ways that we're using language to craft certain assumptions. Whether we are aware of it or not really depends. But as an example, so we can think about if we were to read a story in a newspaper and an individual was positioned as Dr. Susan Salary. What is conveyed there is quite different than if the writing was restructured to be a single mother of two, Susan Salary. So we can see in that really simple example that word choices are crafting a particular identity, and they hold a great degree of power in regards to what the reader, the recipient of these ideas, would take away about this person, this identity, Susan Salary versus a single mother of two, Susan Salary. As another example, if we think about either spoken or written language, a child that was attacked, we could write it in different ways. Joe Smith attacked the child. So someone is accountable for the attack versus the child was attacked. We don't really know. There's some ambiguity there. Attack on a child is even more ambiguous. It's nominalized. So There's not a person that's positioned as being responsible for this attack. So those are just some examples of how it is through language that particular accounts of events, of people, of who people are, what people know, what they don't know, comes to be. And so this really leads us to this understanding and belief that really a single word can make all the difference. So as an example of this, there's been some research that has highlighted that in medical contexts, when physicians ask people, do you have any questions at the end of their intake, folks will often say, no, I don't have any questions. But when one little word is changed to some, do you have some questions? What typically happens is that people actually offer new accounts of what's happening that leads to different diagnoses or response from the physicians. So that's just one example of how a single word can fundamentally change what happens next in an interaction, and even what happens next in regards to how we view people, how we view the world. And so this is really a basic kind of foundation for our understanding and our belief around how the language that we use to talk about autism and autistic people is really shaping how we think about autism and how we think about people. So a question that we wanted to pose to all of you and invite your responses is, thank you, Kristen, how would changing how we speak and write about autism change how we think about autism? So I'll open it up to some of your thoughts, and I can see the chat. So someone says, Olivia says, I think it would lead to a more nuanced view of autism and people being able to interact better with us. Paul notes that open language leads to open lives. It's a beautiful way to phrase it. The ways we react to challenges. Olivia also adds, and also would allow to understand our point of view. Are there any other, I should say, are there some other responses? Ian says, I think there are positives associated with autistic traits. Perhaps there would be more recognitions of this. Yes. Well, feel free to continue adding. Marie says strengths-based diagnosis would be a possibility. Continue adding, and we're hopeful, as Noah said, to return to these comments. I'll pass it to Stephen.
Oh, Stephen is muted.
Okay, because we unmuted all of you, didn't we, at the beginning?
Okay, thank you. I will talk about how autistic people have changed the deficit narrative, which is partly through the activism of the neurodiversity movement, although that's actually not limited to autistic people. But taking a step back, so just as our paper was following the leadership of autistic people, autistic scholars, as well as advocates who are outside of academia. So there's both kind of traditional scientific expertise as well as kind of experiential expertise through, just through the lived experience of being autistic. And actually, I do have a paper as well that autistic people, this was a group of, it was open to everyone in the community and autistic people tended to have more knowledge about autism than non-autistic people, which was in part because they were more likely to identify strengths as accurately part of the concept of autism. So whereas a deficit narrative, pathologizes any differences between autistic people and non-autistic people, even if they might be inherently neutral or context dependent, or can function as strengths, again, at least in some contexts. But autistic people have changed how autism is framed, including in the diagnosis itself. It actually says that, the so-called perseverative or intense interests, can, in the DSM-5, the latest edition of the diagnostic manual, that they can lead to success in education and career. And this is in part based on research and autistic people's testimony, but it's also autistic people were, well, I was part of a group of autistic activists in the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network who kind of lobbied the neurodevelopmental disorders work group that revised the criteria. So there's been more engagement with the autistic community, and through that, there have been changes such as, just in case I haven't made it clear, so there is a general tendency for autistic people to have a less pathological view of autism than non-autistic people. Partially that seems to be related to being more likely to be aware of and involved in the neurodiversity movement. But being aware has the same trend for autistic and non-autistic people alike, and as that awareness has grown, more people have been influenced by it, but I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself again. But it's also just through our own experience, and so an example is that non-autistic people, I believe it may have started kind of with the National Autistic Society here in the UK, that this puzzle piece symbol was by kind of parent advocates, and sometimes it's been used to represent autism as something broken with like missing pieces that needs to be fixed, or like a problem to be solved, or it can also represent that autism is seen as puzzling or kind of confusing and mysterious. Either of which is stigmatizing and pathologizing. And so a lot of autistic people challenge this with alternative representations, and so autistic people complain to the journal Autism, which actually was founded by the National Autistic Society, which had this puzzle piece symbol you can see on the left, and including with personal correspondence, and also non-autistic people also who are, are parents or have listened to autistic people, have also conducted research, for example. Autistic people have too, but in this case, Morten Ann Gernsbacher is a mother of an autistic, now young adult, who, led a paper that was, and I believe Bev Harp was one of the co-authors who's autistic. But this paper was about the fact that the puzzle piece symbol contributes to stigma toward autism. And even though a lot of autistic people are saying that was obvious, sometimes it takes research and, and presenting evidence more formally to kind of prove this, and so to speak. And so with that change, you know, now there's a kind of this different kind of loop symbol here, but that's less offensive. And actually, as the Journal of Autism has listened to autistic people more, it's had a greater impact. And autistic people are more likely, in part because autistic people are more likely to, you know, retweet and whatever on social media and share, you know, so that it helps when people work together and listen to autistic people. And this in part is because of this double empathy problem we were talking about before that the autistic scholar Damian Milton came up with, that like the puzzle piece symbol would frame the problem of autistic people not understanding non-autistic people as a problem of the autistic person, but actually it tends to work both ways. And, you know, sometimes autistic people understand and relate to one another better than non-autistic people understand us. And sometimes we understand non-autistic people better than they understand us as well. So, you know, but there's often so much of this non-autistic privilege until that lens is changed. And yeah, so there was a study that, you know, Noah did, and autistic people were more accurate. They had less tendency, I mean, toward a self-enhancement bias than non-autistic people, less likely to have an inflated view of whether they would be rejected. But I'm sorry, was that study by you or?
It's a study we are working on right now.
Okay.
Yes, it's a study where we have autistic people interacting with other people, unfamiliar people they haven't met before, and sometimes the other person is autistic and sometimes the other person is non-autistic, and we have them evaluate each other after the conversation. But in this one particular study, we also had them evaluate how they thought they were going to be evaluated by another person. Do you think this other person liked you after this conversation? And what we tended to find is that non-autistic people overestimated how much their partner liked them, which tends to be found very commonly in social psychology. It's called a self-enhancement bias. We tend to think people like us more than they actually report liking us, which is presumed to be adaptive because it gives you social confidence to seek out social opportunities that you might shy away from if you didn't think so highly of yourself. Well, in this study, it turns out that we found autistic people were much more accurate in predicting how they were going to be viewed by a conversation partner than non-autistic people. So if you frame this from a deficit model, you could say autistic people do not show the typical self-enhancement bias, and this is going to be to present challenges for them socially. But on the other hand, you might say, wait a second, they were more accurate. They actually showed greater social perception than the non-autistic people. So it really depends how you're framing your understanding of autism to interpret findings. They could be interpreted in very different ways depending on the framework you're using.
So thank you. Yes, I thought you were, when we had talked about it, you were referring to that study. And we do need, you know, non-autistic scholars as well to be in partnership. And so there has been a lot of more support, research in support of this. And so I think we can move to the next slide. And so again, with the neurodiversity movement, have we all heard of the neurodiversity movement? Maybe I should have posed that as a question formally. Has anyone not heard of it? Maybe that might be a more useful question. Has anyone not heard of it? Or if you're comfortable saying so, because there's no shame about it. It is a very recent movement that the term only dates back in its current form to 1999. Okay, thank you, Tim. And yes, and it is a new concept, especially for people who, for example, might, you know, be more like newer to the autistic community, or they're more, maybe they have a recent diagnosis, or I I had a diagnosis for many years before I even realized, you know, that the disability rights movement existed, or that the neurodiversity or autism rights movement. But it's a socio-political movement. It started sort of as a different form for maybe the autism rights movement, and viewing autism as sort of this inseparable part of identity, opposing a cure for autism. But celebrating autism isn't the same as opposing any form of support, or even maybe ways to mitigate or ameliorate some of the difficulties of being autistic. And not all, we were hearing about this kind of interactive model, you know, from Kristen, and I think not all the, you know, the difficulties are maybe just situated in the environment or the situation maybe, but maybe there can even be some inherent difficulties to some extent. And maybe to some extent they can be, you know, basically mitigated, or people can learn to leverage their differences as strengths and as positively as they can. But I think that there's been that misunderstanding of it is partly maybe it's just genuine misunderstanding, but it also seems to be something that's been used to discredit it. But actually, as people are more aware of the movement, they're more likely to have views in line with it, like viewing autism as an identity that needs no cure. So that's something that I found in a study years ago. But part of, in terms of what's more relevant to this paper, part of what autism being, you know, inseparable from the person means that autistic people in the movement and other allies have tended to support identity first language, like autistic person rather than person first language would be, for example, person with autism. Could also, you know, Audi or ASPI or all these other terms are also examples of identity first language. And Jim Sinclair, I believe it was 1999, the same year that the neurodiversity term really kind of began in its current usage, you know, was kind of coined within the autistic community. Jim wrote this article called "Why I Dislike Person First Language," and says, you know, I'm autistic because I cannot be separated from how my brain works. I'm autistic because autism is an essential feature of me as a person. I'm autistic because I accept and value myself the way I am. You know, so there were these three different arguments, and the movements tended to follow this condition, but part of, or tradition, did I say condition? But part of respect means understand, and support for autonomy means that not all autistic people prefer identity first language. And when speaking with an autistic person, if you know their language preference, you should support it. So, you know, if someone wants to be called a person with autism, then don't refer to them as an autistic person. So hopefully that helps to clarify some of the ideas about the movement. And I think the fact that this movement has become more influential is partly how this paper was able to be published, to be honest, I think. And in the journal that we published it in actually even put it into its author guidelines. And we recommended, you know, tending toward identity first language, but preferring, you know, acquiescing to the preference of autistic people. I think there's been this kind of sea change in the autism field, more research and practices that are toward the preferences of autistic people. So thank you. Oh, am I to, well, what are some examples of ableist language that you've personally encountered?
I have enabled unmuting for everybody, so people can now speak, and also post comments in the chat.
So I saw one comment from Pete who mentioned
well, Pete said that the term is relatively new to him, is the neurodiversity term. Is that what you're referring to?
I think Brittany is.
And I was saying, yes, it is a fairly recent term. So, and a lot of people are less likely to be aware of it, especially if they haven't had as much exposure to the active autistic community and people who, you know, really identify with autism.
One of the terms that is now controversial is neurodiverse, because some of the industry use it as a politically correct equivalent for autistic or, you know, with problems, and people virulently oppose neurodiverse. But the problem with language is that if you replace it with neurodivergent, it's also easy to label, you know, autistic, I mean, the problem people as neurodivergent. So you're just moving the problem. It's the attitudes that need to be changed.
Well, I would think that a group is neurodiverse if it includes both, you know, a variety of so-called neurotypes. You know, maybe a group of autistic and non-autistic people might be neurodiverse. If it's a group of autistic people only, arguably, it's not neurodiverse, because within that group itself, you know, maybe it's people of a similar brain type, autism, and so they're neurodivergent in the sense that they differ from the kind of, if you want to call it, neurotype of the majority, so-called neuromajority. But if that makes sense, and I think that's the way that a lot of other autistic scholars have explained it too.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and
I think Brittany's back. Are you back with us, Brittany?
Yeah, sorry about that. I got kicked out. Apologize.
And is Brittany gonna
Nice
take over now?
Okay, great. So
Okay.
yeah, so I wanted to share some examples from our paper of potentially ableist language. And you know, in the interest of full disclosure, we want to point out that you know, what language counts as ableist certainly depends on time, place, and the manner of use. And so these are not you know, universal truths. And also that we made this table really as a guide for the language choices for non-autistic researchers, and not to police the language choices of autistic people, very similar to, you know, what Stephen was saying, as, you know, just always respecting the language preferences, you know, of the autistic person with whom you're interacting. So some examples you know, that we had identified was the term special interests, and an alternative to that might be, you know, an area of interest or expertise, focused interests or passionate interests. Special needs could be another potentially ableist term, and an alternative might be, you know, describing that individual's specific needs and disabilities, rather than using kind of special needs as a blanket term to describe that. Additionally, challenging behavior, disruptive behavior, and problem behavior may be ableist. And alternatively, we would recommend that researchers consider using terms like meltdown, stimming, or description of the specific behavior. And these alternatives that we're suggesting were really pulled from you know, literature that was written by autistic people, or other research that has shown that on language preferences. And then we've also kind of talked a little bit about the person first language, which is, person with autism versus identity first language, which is autistic person. And the research consensus is generally that from the research that has been conducted, that either on the autism spectrum or autistic person tend to be the most preferred choices, but certainly we want to respect the language choices of whoever it is that we are interacting with. So I think we can move to the next slide. So just a couple of more examples to share with you. So we mentioned, high and low functioning or high and low support needs. And instead, we recommend that researchers describe specific strengths and needs and acknowledge that the level of support that an individual needs likely varies across the different domains in which we function. As an alternative to at risk for ASD, we recommend alternative of increased likelihood or increased chance of autism. We recommend staying away from burden or suffering from autism, and instead, use words like the impact of autism or effect of autism, things like this. For autism symptoms, we recommend that researchers instead consider using terms like specific autistic characteristics or describing the specific characteristics, features, or traits that they are referring to. I see a comment from Paul. He says, when language changes, the emphasis can be lost. With it, help from services. Yeah, I definitely think that's a good point. I'm not sure I 100% understand, but I think, are you referring maybe to this this option here of the ableist language being treatment and an alternative being support services or strategies, Paul?
Thank you for this. Just keeping up to date so that when we fill out assessments and different things for services or diagnosis, that we are answering in a way that meets their criteria. If we say it in a nice way, then we may be lost for benefits or something like that.
Sure, yeah, that definitely makes sense. That's a really good point. And so just lastly, the last example that we'll share is, the phrase of like psychopathology. So an alternative to that we would recommend would be saying neurodevelopmental conditions or neuropsychiatric conditions.
There is a good comment in the chat about special educational needs, because it's a word which is widely used in schools and in education, and it would suggest maybe, what would you suggest be a better descriptor? I'm aware of most job title includes SEND at this time.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know that I necessarily have a term that I would suggest that it be replaced with. I can open it up to my co-presenters and see if they might have some examples that they've encountered.
I would prefer the term just, disabilities, or disability if it's a single one. It's the term of the disability rights movement, and which has been an international movement, and which has used a sort of a social model, so to speak, of disabilities to some extent. And that social model originated here in the UK, and disability studies really as a field, really the study of the disability rights movement in a way, and in the experiences of, the experiences of disabled people, but in line with the movement. It's kind of the academic arm of the movement, kind of started here in the UK as well. And because disability isn't just seen as a function of the individual, but an interaction between the individual's traits or impairments and the environment. And it's also, and so it's a term that's become part of the community, and and their shirts, saying disabled and proud, but I don't know that people really say special educational needs or whatever, and or special. I think because if it's special, it sounds like it could be a bit othering or a bit patronizing, even though it's with good intentions. I think a lot of people with disabilities or disabled people have been uncomfortable with the term, but again, not everyone. I know some, you know, some disabled people who would consider themselves disability rights activists who, you know, maybe grew up with the term and they like the term, but I think most probably do not.
Oh, okay, my turn. So I was just going to talk a little bit about my personal research history as a demonstration of how my thinking has shifted from emphasizing more of this deficit framework to more inclusive kind of understanding that we've been discussing today. We've been highlighting so far how language about autism impacts what researchers study, how they study it, the conclusions they draw. And I think just looking back at my earlier work is a good demonstration of this. From a deficit model, as we've been talking about, it's assuming that any difference in comparison to a non-autistic sample is an indication not just of a difference, but something lacking. And there's been this inherent assumption throughout autism research that those differences are somehow the primary factor underlying social disability in autism. So when the emphasis is put on these individual characteristics of autistic people that differ from typicality, and they are seen as the primary mechanisms of their disability, then the focus of quote unquote treatment is targeting a change on those mechanisms. So there is a long history of literature and autism research demonstrating differences in theory of mind, which is a fancy jargon term basically that refers to understanding what other people may be thinking or feeling or accurately gauging their intentions. Or a focus on trying to normalize autistic people's social skills with the presumption that developing more normative social skills will lead to better success in a more neurotypical world. So if you just look, for instance, at the history of some of my papers, this dates back to, I think this paper came out in 2007, one of my earlier papers. I used to study a lot of social attention differences among autistic people. And in this one particular paper, we found that autistic people attended differently to some elements of social pictures than non-autistic people, and we were comparing them to other clinical conditions like schizophrenia. And throughout the paper, we used terms like impairment, which implies that the way that autistic people were looking at these scenes was impaired, with the assumption that that must relate somehow to their social disability. Well, buried in this paper a little bit further is that the autistic people in the study actually did not differ in their accuracy of emotion recognition, the actual task. They did look at the stimuli differently, but it did not lead to a deficit in actual performance. So the leap we made to assuming that this is somehow an impairment is not belied by the actual evidence of the study. That is the framework, of course, that I was trained under, that any difference from the typical comparison group is signifying impairment. Next slide. So yes, this is just one example of many where any difference from non-autistic people is interpreted as an impairment. And then, of course, many treatments, especially behavioral or what we call psychosocial treatments, social skills training groups, for instance, are designed to either implicitly or explicitly try to change those impairments, to fix them, to normalize them to some degree. And the inherent assumption in a lot of these psychosocial services is that normalizing these characteristics are going to lead to some better personal or professional outcomes for autistic people. And there's been a lot of evidence evaluation of these programs, and they do sometimes demonstrate benefits in terms of the context of that social skills training. based on, you can have autistic people demonstrate the more normative social behaviors that you're training them to do. They may even perform better on some standardized assessments of social skills or social cognition, recognizing emotion on faces, for instance. But generally speaking, these programs have failed to generalize to better real-world outcomes for autistic people. They don't seem to be associated with much improvement in personal and professional outcomes, although there's a lot of variability, and there's often secondary benefits from some of these social skill groups, like meeting other like-minded people and developing friendships. But in terms of the actual treatment effect, they can be limited. And of course, I don't want to underplay this idea that trying to get autistic people to change their social behavior and their social thinking to be more normative often comes with a big cost. You're asking somebody to act in ways that are not authentic or natural for them. And for a lot of autistic people, this can be incredibly challenging and very effortful and be exhausting to try to present themselves as more typical. There's now a new literature in autism research focused on the costs of what we call camouflaging behaviors, trying to pass as more neurotypical or masking behaviors. It tends to be associated with mental health difficulties, because you can realize how challenging this is to try to present yourself as somebody different from who you are in the hopes that that will lead to better inclusion and acceptance, instead of course, putting the onus on the broader society to accept autistic differences as being acceptable and welcomed and even celebrated within broader society. But why do these psychosocial services not seem to work very much? I'll get to that on the next slide, Kristen. Well, from my view, and a lot of people working in this area now, including some of my co-authors on this paper, social disability is not just of the individual. Although autism research historically has focused on differences at the level of the autistic person, maybe brain differences, behavioral differences, social disability, as Stephen was talking about, emerges within a social context. And a social context, by definition, is involving more than a single individual. We had alluded to earlier the work of Damian Milton, who has written extensively about this idea of double empathy, that although autism research has highly emphasized difficulties autistic people have interacting with and understanding non-autistic people, very rarely do we see examples in the literature of non-autistic people sharing that same difficulty understanding and interacting with autistic people. The blame for poor social interaction between autistic and non-autistic people historically in the literature is put upon the shoulders of autistic people, hence this desire to try to normalize them, thinking that is going to lead to better outcomes. But there's a literature now, empirical research, showing, yes, non-autistic people have theory of mind deficits understanding autistic people. They often judge autistic people unfavorably very quickly, and even can be inaccurate in their assumptions of autistic people's competencies based on superficial judgments from seeing them from afar. We have done some of this empirical work in my lab, but you never see that difficulty non-autistic people have interacting with autistic people being referred to as an impairment or a deficit that requires treatment. Although we are working on ways of saying, well, can we affect non-autistic people's attitudes about autism and their presumptions about autism and counteract some of their misconceptions about autism, and will that lead to better social experiences for autistic people in non-autistic environments? And we're seeing some efficacy of that approach with limitations. We also have seen in some of our research now that familiarity and understanding of autism is related, among non-autistic people, is related to better inclusionary attitudes and, in fact, better perceptions of autistic people, which, in my view, is optimistic because it suggests that with greater inclusion, with more exposure to autistic people, and not just autistic stereotypes or misrepresentations they may see in media portrayals, for example, that we may over time gradually see greater understanding between autistic and non-autistic people, which should in the long term benefit autistic people's outcomes. And just to end here on my part for a second, I would highlight a recent finding from our lab counter to this deficit model framework. I mentioned earlier that we have had studies where we have people meet somebody for the first time, and sometimes these are two unfamiliar autistic people. Well, in a pure deficit model, you would predict that these interactions are going to go even more poorly than an autistic and a non-autistic interaction. After all, these are two people with social deficits. Shouldn't it be compounded when two autistic people are interacting? But we find, perhaps not surprisingly to people in the audience, that the opposite occurs. Oftentimes, although there's a lot of variability because autism is not the only characteristic of people, and there are many reasons that people get along with one another or don't get along, but we do see on average that two autistic people interacting often have better social outcomes from that interaction, report liking each other better, or connecting better, or finding more agreement or of conversational topics, for instance, than autistic and non-autistic people. The interaction is actually enhanced for the autistic person when interacting with another autistic person relative to interacting with a non-autistic person. Okay, next slide. And now I'm going to hand it over to the next presenter. Is this me, Kristen, or do you want to handle this?
I think this is Brittany. Is Brittany still here? She might have got kicked off again.
Oh, she got kicked off again.
Well, I guess I can just quickly take you through these two slides because we're sort of running out of time anyway. But we tried to pose some questions to researchers and say, please reflect on the language that you're using when you write about autistic people or when you have speaking engagements about autistic people. And these are the questions that we asked researchers to reflect on. So just very quickly, if you're using language in a paper, it's something that you would use in a conversation with an autistic person. I think it's good to assume that when you write an academic paper, autistic people do read them. And you should make that assumption in your writing. So you don't want to use any language that suggests autistic people are inherently inferior to non-autistic people, because we know that it has to do with people's characteristics plus the context they're in. And you don't want to assume that autism is something to be fixed, cured, controlled, or avoided. Or you don't want to unnecessarily medicalize autism. So this happens a lot when people show traits that are neutral or even positive. They'll still suggest that there needs to be an intervention planned to make autistic people look more like typical people or non-autistic people. Okay, so again, we don't want to suggest that the goal of our research is behavioral control or to make people less autistic, but rather we want to grant as much autonomy and agency and contribute to people's quality of life. And another thing that I think is really important is that researchers often are afraid of just doing things that aren't traditional in their field. So we don't want to rely on language that could be ableist just because other people in our field do it. A lot of things about academia don't reward people going against the traditional way of speaking, but we want to challenge people to do that so that we can break this cycle of using ableist language that then perpetuates ableist ideology, and ultimately will avoid othering autistic people or acting as if they are completely not able to be, we're unable to understand autistic people in any way and they're completely different than non-autistic people, when we know that that's not actually true. So our last slide, I think we're just under the wire here. The five of us were discussing the process of having this paper published. And it was not, we didn't get 100% positive reviews in our submission process. So when you write an academic article, you submit it to reviewers, they tell you everything they didn't like about it, and then you have to fix it and send it back. So in our first iteration of this paper, a lot of the things that the reviewers didn't like is that they felt that it accused researchers of being ableist. And a lot of researchers felt that an accusation of ableism was worse than the actual ableism itself. So we do think that since the article was published, we've gotten mostly positive feedback. So we think that attitudes are changing, and people, many researchers are working hard to change the way that they talk and write about autism. But not everybody is doing this. And there are some very prominent researchers in our field that persist with deficit frameworks. They talk about promoting cures, they talk about prevention, they talk about a future where autistic people aren't part of it. And we think that's extremely problematic. So we want to continue to press researchers to avoid doing this. And we want to continue this discussion with researchers so that they understand that they're working under an ableist framework. And things like cures and prevention is part of that system of ableism that they themselves are perpetuating with that kind of framing. So I think we are out of time, but if we have like 30 seconds, if anybody wants to add in the chat, if there are any concerns about how autism is written or spoken about in autism research.
While people are doing that, I wanted to thank people for sharing their experiences of ableism that they've unfortunately had. And, hopefully with more understanding of ableism, we, as disabled people or autistic people in this case, will encounter less of it.
If I may, I'm wondering whether ableist languages research is perpetuated by certain sources of funding arising from a particular segment of society, of parental community.
That's absolutely true. I think I haven't seen the updated graph lately, but I think the amount of funding that goes to genetics research, which is designed to identify genes linked to autism so that we can then somehow prevent autism from occurring, I think that gets the most funding. So funding is definitely funneled toward research that I would construe as being ableist research.
And primarily, especially here in the United States, our large funders of autism research at the national level, like the National Institutes of Health, tend to highly favor biological research, or so studies of the brain, studies of genes, for instance, to try to differentiate what makes autistic people different from non-autistic people. But again, as Kristen says, those efforts, while they do have some, they can have scientific merit depending on your interpretation and what you do with that information. A lot of it comes from this deficit framework with the implicit assumption that we are looking to change these differences that we are finding. I myself personally have had a lot of trouble acquiring funding from NIH for more behavioral research, because they are really focused on things that they think are going to be more amenable to treatment. I think that assumption is probably not accurate, but that comes out of this historical model of how autism has been researched for many decades. And there are big cultural differences, I think, between the United States and the UK, where the UK has been much more at the forefront of disability rights advocacy and the neurodiversity movement, and America over here is slower to catch up. But I do sense that is starting to change and be adopted more here in the States.
Oh, that's very encouraging to hear. Any questions in the audience? I'm wondering, are there sources of autism research funding that are non-ableist and promote the more enlightened understanding?
If anyone knows the answer to that, I would like to be directed to it. I think that there are some smaller foundations maybe that would be, it's probably, I can think of a few regional funders here that are small. It's not big money, but I think there are maybe pockets of places that fund research that is less focused on prevention and cure.
Well,
But
A
and
good example would be the Templeton Foundation that funded Catherine Crompton and Sue Fletcher Watson, who have recently published a series of really interesting findings suggesting that autistic people do show some enhanced communication efficiency with other autistic people compared to non-autistic people, challenging a deficit framework in communication in autism. But yes, there are other alternative sources. I have funding from the state of Texas, actually funding my work currently. They were more receptive to my ideas than at the federal level, thankfully. So yeah, we have to get creative, but there are some opportunities out there.
I think the Organization for Autism Research in the US, and I don't know if they fund international research, I think they're a relatively good organization, but again, they're small. They have some autistic advisors as well. But again, most of the money and power seems to be concentrated in organizations that have, done a lot of unfortunate harm, arguably, against autistic people. And it's sad to see, these organizations that are, so-called advocacy organizations, fight in a way that's, against the interests, the voiced interests of autistic people. In a lot of other communities, there isn't such a disconnect. Maybe in some other communities there are, but many others, it's not such a disconnect between the charities or nonprofits that are supposed to be serving us well, and then the people who are actually being served or done a disservice.
On this note, any further comments? Some further comments, I should say. Thank you very much. This was, there are a lot of comments in the chat about thanking the researchers for this very interesting discussion, very interesting and important topic.
Thank you so much for having us. This was such a privilege.
People be encouraged to share it beyond this organization if they're so inclined, and will it be kept up or for only a few weeks?
Yes, we'll share it widely and encourage people to share widely because this is a very important research and important topic, and it's also important for autistic people to reflect on this, to avoid internalized ableism by accepting certain language. And it provides a good explanation about person first versus identity first language. So, this is fantastic. Thank you very much for your time and this excellent presentation and discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic.